It's a new season of the Liz Wheeler Show. What this show won't be: boring, old, ineffectual commentary. Go tune into Fox if you want the generic political yammering that got us into this mess. Small assumptions allow big lies. So the Liz Wheeler Show will challenge everything. On this show, it's be based or our country dies. What does it mean to be based? Stay tuned. Welcome, everybody, to the Liz Wheeler Show. We have Mike Benz on the show with us today. He will be here in just a second because in 2016, the censorship industrial complex unleashed their algorithm on us on social media. If you are a conservative on Facebook and you posted anything in support of Donald Trump, if you posted anything against Hillary Clinton, suddenly people began to see your posts less. If you are specifically a media personality and you had built up this big organic following on Facebook, people who had actively chosen to like and follow your page in order to read and digest the content and thoughts that you presented to them, all of a sudden you'd start getting all these messages from people saying, "Are you still posting? What happened? I don't see your videos. I used to see them every day in the morning when I would open up my Facebook app. People would tell me I'd get your final point on there. But where is it? All of a sudden it's gone. Are you okay? Did you stop creating content?" And the answer to that was no, I didn't stop creating content, but Facebook stopped serving my content to you. Facebook stopped conservatives from speaking to the people who wanted to hear the topics that we were discussing. This happened across the board in conservative media. Fast forward to 2020, we have the New York Post reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop story, the biggest political story perhaps of this century as it relates to the corruption of a presidential candidate. And yet when the New York Post published this story on then Twitter, owned by Jack Dorsey at the time, this is pre-Elon Musk, Twitter wouldn't allow you to share the URL of that story. The mainstream media, of course, wasn't going to cover it because they were totally in the tank for Joe Biden. They knew that this story about Hunter Biden selling access to foreign adversaries, selling access to his father, the vice president, to foreign nations who are our adversaries, would change centrists' independents' decision whether they're going to vote for Joe Biden. So they stifled it. They censored it completely. They said, you're not allowed to send this, even in a DM. It's misinformation. This arguably changed the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. After this happened, and after the Hunter Biden laptop story finally came to light, despite the censorship, after everyone had cast their vote, of course, Democrats who had voted for Joe Biden, a significant percent of them, up to 7%, said that they wouldn't have voted for Joe Biden had they known about the Hunter Biden laptop story, which that story had broke in October, over a month before the actual election. So my question today, the question that we're going to pose to Mike Benz, he's going to join us here in just a second. What kind of censorship are they deploying against us? What are they trying to hide, and what tools are they going to use to hide it? That is the topic of today's show. We are going to start the show with a prayer. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl through the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Our show today is proudly sponsored by Cozy Earth. I love Cozy Earth. This is a tried and true sponsor of the show because I have Cozy Earth sheets on my bed at my house right now, and I absolutely love them. Remember back in college when everyone used jersey sheets on their bed, and they were very comfortable, but they got baggy because it's basically t-shirt material? Well, as adults, we should not use jersey sheets on our bed, but Cozy Earth sheets, they're made of bamboo. They're made of premium viscose bamboo. They have the good parts of a jersey sheet, meaning that t-shirt, that feeling that a t-shirt's hugging you, while also having the silken smoothness of adult sheets. They're so comfortable. I'm raving about them because I truly love them. They're also temperature regulating, which means if you sleep hot and your husband or wife sleeps cold, they actually regulate your temperature so that you're not either freezing or sweaty the whole night. It's lovely. There's also a 10-year warranty on the sheets, which means that Cozy Earth trusts their own product. They're confident in their product. Otherwise, they wouldn't make you an offer like that. If you go to cozyearth.com/Liz and use my promo code Liz, you can get 40% off. That is a huge discount just for you guys. Go to cozyearth.com/Liz, use my promo code Liz for 40% off. Our show today is also sponsored by Crowd Health. This is a brand new sponsor, so I want to welcome them to the show. I hope you guys also welcome them. Any company, any business, any organization based enough and brave enough to stand beside us and support this content, we are happy to have in our corner. So we all know that health insurance is confusing. It's expensive, it's frustrating, it's corrupt. Claim denials, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, are becoming more and more common. Thanks, Obama. 1 in 5 Obamacare claims were denied last year. That is unacceptable. The headache of health insurance is exactly why Crowd Health was created. It's not exactly health insurance. It's not health insurance. It's a better way to pay for healthcare through crowdfunding. So stop sending your money to big insurance companies who profit off not paying your bills, and instead check out Crowd Health. Look, my husband works in the medical profession. I've told you guys this before. So I see firsthand how tedious, how difficult, how expensive, how broken our healthcare system is for everybody, not just for patients. But with Crowd Health, for just $175 for an individual or $575 for a family of 4 or more, compare that, by the way, to your insurance premium, you'll get access to a community of people who are willing to help you in the event of an emergency. You'll get access to telemedicine visits, discounted prescriptions, and so much more without doctors' networks getting in the way. And of course, you'll join the crowd. It's a group of members just like us who want to help pay for each other's unexpected medical events without breaking the bank. Let Crowd Health help with your healthcare needs. Get started today for just $99 per month for your first 3 months. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use my promo code Liz. Joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. The mandatory disclaimer here is that Crowd Health is not insurance, but I just described to you what it is and how valuable it is to fighting back against our broken healthcare system. Go to joincrowdhealth.com, use my promo code Liz. All right, with us today is the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. He is a former State Department official. His focus now is free speech because he's seen firsthand what the government is doing to try to stifle your free speech and mine. Mike, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's Mike Benz, ladies and gentlemen. All right, Mike, give us a brief overview before we get into what the deep state has planned for this election cycle. Give everyone watching the show a brief detail on your background. How do you know what the deep state is going to do? Because you worked there. Just tell us a little bit about your area of expertise here.
Well, I've been very deep in this subject for about 8 years now. Is when I first started writing a book and doing a documentary on internet censorship, and it's been really sort of a life journey, if you will, that sort of took me into the government in many respects and into the role that I had at state and now in the civil society space. But effectively, when I was young, I was an avid chess player, and I sort of came of age during that time when chess computers overtook humans, and the older fuddy-duddies in the room were saying that couldn't happen, and you'd never be able to overcome humans would always be able to overcome AI. And that was a very sort of formative time for me. And then about fast forward 20 years later, when the Trump election in 2016 was happening, I noticed that AI censorship technology was being developed, and it was being funded by some very strange, dark places, namely our federal government, and within that, the U.S. military. And I started screaming to basically all my friends and family that this was going to do to speech online what chess computers did to the game of chess. That is, when the early outset of censorship started in 2016, people thought that they would be able to evade it simply by cheekily changing up the way they talk about things or changing little keywords. And I was trying to tell everyone this is an existential threat. You're never going to be able to escape censorship once this becomes the norm online. And so the process of trying to prove that to people sort of took me into the process of beginning to write a whole book on it and then begin to network within the space. And, as I worked my way up into what was behind it, it became clearer and clearer that it was essentially this diplomacy, defense, intelligence apparatus within the U.S. federal government, primarily concerned with foreign policy, and that internet censorship in America was not really a domestic issue about domestic platform decisions or domestic policy at all. It was really about the agenda of our foreign policy establishment and their work to secure the American empire, and they thought that the political threats at home, as well as free speech around the world, was the biggest threat to that.
Okay, explain that to me, because it's an interesting perspective. My question for this segment is, back in 2016, I think especially those of us who are in the conservative media space started experiencing the censorship I confess, I kind of dismissed people's complaints about, oh, I'm getting censored on then Twitter, I'm getting censored on Facebook at first, because we'd never experienced that. All of these big tech platforms were kind of the Wild West. It was a meritocracy. It was kind of cutthroat. It was really fun. Then some people started complaining about, oh, my tweets are being, suppressed. My post is invisible on Facebook. And I'm like, yeah, maybe you're just not that interesting. Who knows? And I kind of downplayed it until, again, and I'm saying mea culpa now because I was wrong, until it happened to me, until Facebook would notify me that my posts were being unboosted, whatever the opposite of boosted is. They were being penalized. I was being stifled in the algorithm. Then, of course, we had stuff happen on YouTube where I'd get strikes and my channel would be shut down just for talking about regular stuff that, of course, the left doesn't like. Fast forward to 2020, it was the Hunter Biden laptop story, just outright silencing of a report about the family of the presidential candidate. Any dissent from the COVID narrative, you got booted absolutely from these big tech platforms. So my question for this segment is, what do you see on tap for 2024 when it comes to censorship? And you can tie your answer to that question into this larger picture of, okay, here's the point of censorship, whether it's because they hate us personally, they hate our beliefs, or it seems like you're suggesting that this is a larger globalist thing.
Yeah, it's not really a right-left thing. I don't want to say at all, but almost at all, in the sense that this is really about what we call the foreign policy establishment.
So what do you mean by that when you say that?
So we have an American homeland where we live, and we have an American empire, which is basically almost every other country, save a few others, that are effectively political vassal states, or that we exert influence on so that we can secure natural resources there, so that we can have the oil, the gas, the lithium, the cobalt, the aluminum, the gold, the diamonds, the copper, so that we can have trade markets, so that we have export zones for Walmart and for Microsoft and Apple and for Google IT products. We have this international finance system. We have both parties of Republican and Democrat have always sort of come from this foreign policy establishment in terms of their rise to power, and have always been vetted by these institutions, and they have international interests. Most major U.S. companies, almost all major U.S. companies, are primarily multinational companies in the sense that the U.S. may be their largest market in terms of the pluralism of markets, but most of their profit comes from abroad. So they are reliant on the U.S. federal government and our foreign policy establishment. These are places like the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community, in order to influence events in foreign countries to make them more malleable to U.S. interests, in order to have them buy goods and services that come from the U.S., in order to stop the rise of legislation in foreign countries that might nationalize an industry or dramatically change how profitable it is to operate there. They rely on the U.S. State Department to put pressure on foreign countries in order to preserve their markets. And that is both a Republican and a Democrat thing. The thing is, there is a Republican civil war between the sort of MAGA populist nationalist faction on the one hand and the internationalist faction on the other hand. This is what I often call the blob. This is a term that came from the Obama White House to refer to how the Obama White House felt that this foreign policy establishment was this sort of big alien blob-like creature within Washington that was more powerful than the White House itself. I think that's a very useful thing for people who support Donald Trump or for people who are centrist to sort of understand that even the Obama administration, a left-wing Democrat administration, felt that this force was the same. And you see these same Republican actors in this. You see the George Bush family. You see the Dick Cheney types, the Liz Cheney types. But just because it's bipartisan doesn't mean it's
like the
inclusive.
uniparty. Not really
Right.
bipartisan. It's just like they all have the same goal.
So what you have in the censorship industry are Republicans from that general Michael V. Hayden, sort of Bush Cheney defense, diplomacy, intelligence axis, who are selectively exploiting these sort of Democrat shibboleths about what should be censored in order to win the intra-party civil war against the MAGA faction of the GOP. This is why you see places like the McCain Institute and the Bush Institute playing major roles in the censorship industry, getting millions of dollars of government funding to do censorship work. This is why you see CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy's International Republican Institute, getting millions of dollars to do internet censorship work, even though it's Republican, but they are targeting the MAGA populist nationalist Republicans here in the U.S., as well as right-wing populist groups all over Europe and South America.
So wait a second, let me ask you a question, because I'm tracking on everything you're saying here. I'm following along, and I guess my question is the problem here that the State Department is using these tools that they may deploy against foreign countries, even to manipulate elections or foreign economies, which, to be honest, I'm no neocon, don't get me wrong, but I don't have a ton of problem with that. I don't have a huge problem with that because everyone does it. Kind of just is fact of political life. It's always been done. Is the problem here that it's being deployed against us domestically versus just internationally?
That is the problem. Well, there's two problems now. One is that it's deployed against us domestically. The other is that U.S. tech platforms are being caught in this proxy war around the world. For example, in Brazil, there's a little known history about the story of censorship in Brazil, which is that the censorship ecosystem in Brazil was almost entirely created by the United States State Department and its partners in USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, which also get their pass-through funding from the State Department, in the sense that all of these Brazilian censorship ecosystem players, all of the universities dedicated to it, all of the legal and judicial clerks for the censorship court, the TSE, the fact-checker networks, the disinformation wings of major media institutions in Brazil, a whole coterie of it. Tens of millions of dollars have flowed into it directly from the U.S. State Department to target U.S. platforms. And Elon Musk right now is caught in a proxy war between the blob and populism because they wanted to get rid of Bolsonaro, who was a right-wing populist. Just like they're going after Elon Musk and Rumble all over the EU. The State Department has been working with the EU for this Digital Services Act, which is effectively the NATO censorship law, and they want to make all the right-wing populist parties there, Nigel Farage in the UK, Marine Le Pen in France, the Vox Party in Spain, the AfD Party in Germany, the Matteo Salvini's movement in Italy, all of them inhospitable, unable to share their messages on social media, and so they are pushing foreign governments to pass their own censorship laws in order to do a proxy attack on the thing that's their biggest threat, which is losing elections. And this is not a new story, by the way. This is how censorship really came to the U.S. in a big way. In 2017, these State Department diplomats began doing international roadshows to Europe. They ran back the same roadshow they did for sanctions on Russia after Crimea in 2014. In 2017, they ran back that roadshow for censorship laws rather than sanctions laws in order to stop the rise of the right-wing populist parties there. At the time, they were concerned about the Brexit domino, that there'd be Frexit and Gregxit and Italexit and Spexit if other parties won the same way Brexit did. And so social media was really the biggest threat to NATO, the biggest threat to the EU, in some sense, the biggest threat to the international monetary system. And so this is how you have these kind of big international players like the State Department, the Defense Department, and even places like the CIA playing a highly, highly active role in internet censorship, but they're glued together in that uniparty way, where they'll also go after left-wing populists. Like they will go after Jeremy Corbyn, in the former.
Oh yeah,
or
or didn't they censor Bernie Sanders to a certain extent?
Yeah, they
when he was going
they
against
were targeting
Hillary Clinton?
Bernie Sanders.
So I'm missing one link. Fill in this missing link for me. So you describe how the CIA or the State Department has always had a vested interest in controlling the speech in other countries because of an economic interest that the United States has, and how you can argue that that's proper or improper, but it's definitely different than deploying that apparatus of censorship against the American people. But did that former institution, or did the CIA, the State Department, this blob that had this apparatus to target foreign countries, did it become corrupted with leftist ideology domestically, and then they just harnessed that existing tool against conservatives domestically? Or I'm missing the bridge that connects the two things together.
Well, I wouldn't even really so much refer to it as leftist ideology. You're going to have this same apparatus censoring leftist voices in Ukraine who oppose Zelensky, or leftist voices who oppose, leftist voices who oppose a sort of right-wing institution or political force that's in good standing with the blob. What happens is these issues, these terms of service policies, get selectively either censored or boosted depending on whether they are good for the blob's financial interests.
So how then explain to me this. How is it good for the blob's financial interests to have Brazil be communist?
Well, Bolsonaro was said to be a right-wing populist threat to democracy. He had a lot of flare-ups, shall we say, with the international financial system. Famously, he kicked the IMF out of the country. The IMF actually closed down its office and moved. This is the International Monetary Fund, the gangster banksters that are. If you've ever read a book like Confessions of an Economic Hitman, in terms of understanding, how deep the State Department and its diplomacy axis serves as a debt enforcement collector for the IMF and other industrial players. But Bolsonaro was a threat to financial interests. He was a threat to. He was deemed to be the Trump of the tropics. That's literally.
So it's basically a top-down thing, is what I'm hearing you're saying. You can correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but you're saying that this globalist blob, some in the United States, some even outside of the United States, want control. The best way to control a country is through Marxism or communism, just complete control. That trickles down to free speech. And in order to enrich themselves, these are the people that go war hunting and want to pillage countries just to profit themselves, even while harming millions of people. It's that's sort of where the ideological crossover happens.
Yeah, and again, I don't see it as a Marxist communist thing. This is a neoliberal thing. This is the fusion of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Take Ukraine. The censorship operation in Ukraine, our censorship that we live under in the United States was first created to deal with the Ukraine problem. So let me explain this. The military began, we've had 70 years of free speech diplomacy. We've loved, free speech was not something in the 1940s that was as pumped up as it is now in terms of a national norm. We had a First Amendment, but there were all sorts of laws about what could be shown, in the movies. There were all sorts of decency laws. There were all sorts of restrictions on that. But the internet was a way to pipe influence into foreign countries to carry on our open society doctrine. And this is this idea that after the nature of war changed after World War II, after territorial acquisition by military occupation was outlawed under international law in 1948, the military, the State Department, the intelligence services had to move to a new modality of empire. Instead of military occupation like we had over the Philippines from the 1910s to the 1930s, we had to have a political vassalage system, which meant we needed to influence the hearts and minds in order to influence the elections, in order to control the politicians, or in order to have our politician, our State Department favored politician, win. And so we began what we call free speech diplomacy. That is, all sorts of pressure, all sorts of influence, all sorts of cash bribery from the State Department or USAID or CIA pass-throughs in order to open up societies so that they have free and independent media. The State Department does not recognize foreign elections unless there's free and independent media. But that is a cudgel for us to be able to pipe in our messaging into the system. Because if you don't have free speech in a country, if it's closed off from U.S. influence. And so, I don't have a problem with this, by the way. I think this is, an open society is a good thing. But the problem is it began to be a little too open, because the free and open internet, which was the darling of the Pentagon and the CIA and the State Department for its first 15 years, from 1991 to 2016, free speech on the internet was one of the most precious things to the blob that there could be. It was seen as a way to effectively turbocharge the efficacy of things like color revolutions. If you remember the Arab Spring, which was highly touted by the U.S. media, where the governments of Tunisia and Egypt and all these adversary states opposed that were deemed authoritarian by the U.S. State Department and the Obama administration, all were toppled one by one in Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions. Now, those accounts and organizers happen to have training by CIA back channels like the National Endowment for Democracy, who spent millions of dollars basically organizing and training them about how to set up Facebook pages and use these hashtags and where to coordinate. But the fact is that was all. Free speech was an instrument of U.S. statecraft. The problem was in 2014 when we overthrew the government of Ukraine, and we can talk about whether that characterization is correct or not. I think
pretty
Victoria
correct.
Nuland confessing to $5 billion in funding to the group that did it, and then personally handing out cookies and water bottles as they were throwing Molotov, to them as they were throwing Molotov cocktails in cop cars and surrounding the Parliament building in a January 6th style, insurrection against a democratically elected government. The problem is what happened in the aftermath of the 2014 Ukraine coup is what created the censorship apparatus we currently have, because NATO was not expecting what happened next. They thought they'd put Yatsenyuk in power in Ukraine, and then it would, the whole thing would fall to U.S., EU political vassalage. But what happened instead was the entire eastern half of the country broke away. The Donbass broke away. Crimea broke away, and even voted in an independent referendum to join the Russian Federation. And so NATO said, we've pumped billions of dollars into this, and the entire eastern side of the country is not buying our propaganda. We can't turn it up anymore. We're not penetrating Crimea despite pumping so much in there. We need a mechanism not just to turn our own voice up, but to turn their voices down so that they can't have this robust messaging. They can't access this peer-to-peer communication architecture that they're exploiting to get their own points across. And so this censorship industry really started as this kind of experiment in Central and Eastern Europe. In Germany, which was said to be a major trading partner on gas in particular with Russia, Germany, Ukraine, the V4 countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all the Baltics. That was this zone that NATO set up these centers of excellence for internet censorship in from 2014 to 2016, and then Brexit happened, and then it came to Western Europe, this hybrid warfare doctrine, they called it, and then the Trump election happened, and then all bets were off. Suddenly, this became necessary to save the world to have this censorship apparatus. But again, Ukraine is a right-wing state. Ukraine, remember, the Azov Battalion, for example, one of the largest fighting forces that is at the front lines of the war against Russia, was actually declared by Democrats in 2014 to be a dangerous organization, effectively a sort of white supremacist terrorist group, a Nazi group, and there was a ban on funding going to them. Facebook banned them as a dangerous group because they were as hard right, as far right as they can be. But then what happened? This counter coup broke out in the Donbass and Crimea, and then in 2022, Russia physically invaded the specific territory in Ukraine that is the site of so much of the hydrocarbons that NATO is after in the Donbass. And so Azov became useful to the blob. So this hardcore right-wing Nazi group had all of its sins cleansed. It was uncensored by Facebook. Facebook took them off of the dangerous groups. They don't even have elections anymore. They've not held an election in 4 years, and partly is because Zelensky is down 10 points in the poll to one of the major opposition folks. So they don't want to have an election in case their puppet might lose. But this and several other examples around the world, I think, reveals that you're up against something actually a lot more terrifying than left-wing Marxism communism. You're up against this highly malleable financial system, which will selectively pump up Marxism if it wants to unseat. It will sponsor Antifa if a right-wing populist is rising to power. It will sponsor these communist or these BLM-style, street mafia groups in order to unseat a right-wing populist group. But they will sponsor Nazi groups. They will sponsor hardcore right-wing nationalist groups in order to unseat a left-wing communist or a left-wing populist group who opposes NATO or the State Department from their left-wing flank.
So I think this is complicated, right? I think I'm starting to track through all of this stuff. So you're basically saying that it wasn't necessarily that this blob wanted to endorse free speech because they ideologically believe that speech should be protected. It's that they thought this new channel of internet, by calling it free speech, they could use it to control these different happenings around the world. And then when their opposition also started using the same tactic, using the free and open internet to counter protest or have these revolutions, they were like, wait a second, we can't allow people to do this because we're actually losing with our own tool. And that's when they clamped it down. So that brings us then to 2015, 2016, when we here in the United States started to see this deployed against us. It is, even though I understand what you're saying about the Uniparty, I don't disagree. The different people that you've mentioned on the so-called Republican side are clearly not conservatives. They are members of the Uniparty. It's also inarguable that this has been deployed against right-wing people in the United States. Almost exclusively, with a couple of exceptions.
Exclusively in the United States.
Almost exclusively. Yeah, there's a couple of examples of left-wing censorship. Not too much, though. So what do you expect them to do in the next 2 months before this presidential election? As I said at the beginning, in 2016, we saw the censorship start. In 2020, it got really egregious and blatant. We didn't even know the extent of it until Elon Musk revealed the X-Files, showing that the deep state, the FBI, basically had portals where they could request different things, different posts and things that people said to be censored on Facebook, specifically on Twitter. What do you see happening in the next 60 days?
Right. And just quickly before I answer that, I just want to just add to the first point that you made in that, which is that the only reason that I'm stressing this about it being, bigger than a strictly partisan thing is because I'm someone who talks to members of Congress very frequently on this. And if this was just a Republican thing, then it would be much easier to get Republicans on board. What I'm trying to sort of preview to your audience is why it's difficult to stop this is because there is this critical faction within the Republican Party who actually benefits from the censorship of the other Republicans.
Right.
Like you are not going to see General Michael V. Hayden being censored, on Facebook and YouTube. You're not going to see Dick Cheney or George Bush being censored on YouTube, even though they used to be the enemies of the Democrats.
Kamala's honored to have Dick Cheney's endorsement. Let's all just take a moment and remember that.
But right, yes, good for her. She's killing it.
Yeah, Kamala, I want to send your daughters to die in war with Ukraine. But I digress. Yeah. Keep going, please.
Yeah. So on 2024, one of the main cudgels. They're in an interesting place on this because they are not as powerful domestically as they were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, they had they had a total stranglehold. And in fact, we've had a lot of victories in this space in the past 24 months, and they are intensely aware of them. They complain about them frequently on their own Zoom calls and in their own internal documents. An example that I cite pretty frequently is about 6 months ago when they were gearing up for what they needed to do to censor the 2024 election here in the U.S. and the EU parliamentary elections. And they were complaining after losing X to Elon and Elon firing 85% of the staff there, largely the trust and safety teams. And they were complaining on these calls and in their memos saying, it took us years to build up these relationships inside the companies. It took us years to infiltrate and take over the censorship policies. And then Elon came in and in one fell swoop, crushed us all. It's terrible. And then they were even saying 6 months ago, and Mark Zuckerberg is actually starting to get rid of a lot of us, and we're starting to lose our influence over Facebook. This is one of the reasons that, I was saying I was not surprised at all by Mark Zuckerberg's letter to Chairman Jim Jordan, saying that he folded to Biden government censorship pressure and that he wouldn't do it again. He was echoing what the censorship industry insiders were all saying, which was that he was already boxing them out, starting about 6 months ago. And they were complaining he was sort of riding on Elon's momentum and that pressure from congressional hearings and transcribed interviews and lawsuits and all of this had greatly diminished the hold that they had over social media from 2016 to 2022, because remember there was no hole in the Titanic at that point. Jack Dorsey folded like a lawn chair. Zuckerberg folded like a lawn chair. YouTube wanted to do it in large part, and so there was no way to penetrate that. But then Rumble has become a somewhat robust YouTube alternative. It's obviously not as as sophisticated as the real thing, but it's allowed, the rise of very large channels that have been able to go relatively uncensored and have robust political communications. X is almost completely uncensored and has actually allowed back on all of the voices who were banned in 2019, 2020. And X is actually the largest political thought leadership modality on all social media, even though it's the smallest. Facebook and IG have like 2 billion monthly active users. YouTube is the second most trafficked website on the internet after Google. But X, everyone on X is a content creator. Unlike, the closed garden of Facebook personal posts or YouTube, where 99% of people are just passive watchers. Every time you hit the retweet button, you become a news producer. You have your own news show, even if you're only reaching 50, 100, 200
So are
people.
we not going to face the depth and breadth of censorship in 2024 that we have faced in the past, or is there something new that they're going to deploy?
Well, they've got two tactics that they're deploying simultaneously. One is they are using international. This is where the State Department comes back into this. One is they are using international multilateral forums or foreign countries' internal laws to cut down on support for Trump or Trump proxy groups or basically Trump-aligned networks all around the world here in the U.S. So for example, I mentioned the Brazil story. Brazil's 220 million people. 110 million of those people support Bolsonaro and support Trump because of what the State Department calls the international movement of ideas between Bolsonaro supporters and Trump supporters. So right there, you've just axed a certain percentage of communications to Trump voters. In the EU, this Digital Services Act, which has been this long-term plan by NATO to crush populist groups' ability to use social media. If you recall, just 3 weeks ago, the head of that EU Commission personally threatened Elon Musk in a letter simply for having a conversation, about to have a conversation with Donald Trump, and even threatening with jail time. I don't know if you saw the news just this week, but now the UK Parliament is potentially going to be summoning Elon Musk and launching a criminal probe into Elon Musk there. You know why you haven't heard the UK ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the UK, the head of the U.S. embassy in the UK, say anything about that? Because they're behind it. Why haven't you heard Elizabeth Bagley, the head of the U.S. embassy in Brazil, our U.S. ambassador to Brazil? Why have you not heard her say anything about X being banned and Starlink, a major military contractor responsible for most of the CIA's satellite usage? The U.S. ambassador has been quiet as a peep in 2 weeks after Starlink had its cars, its airplanes, and its bank accounts seized by the Brazilian government. Do you know how fast we would send in the Marines if they did that to ExxonMobil or Microsoft? Or if they had done that to Twitter 1.0 ahead of the 2022 election in Brazil, if Bolsonaro had banned Brazil because Lula supporters were using it? The fact is they are quiet because they are behind it. They have been funding it. They have been bribing people. They have been capacity building all of the censorship lobbying institutions. They have been working on the legislative misinformation bills, and they're going to use this EU Digital Services Act as a crowbar to say that if X does not censor what NATO calls disinformation, and they may go so far as to say that includes questioning the election results. For example, if we have a replay of 2020 where there's uncertainty about who really won, and it's going to come down to legal challenges, or it's going to come down to perceptions of legitimacy, it's a very real possibility that the EU will say, listen, we have this disinformation compliance component now under this law where you cannot question the results of elections. Now, they're going to say elections, but they only mean this election. They don't mean, questioning the results of an election that they, that goes the other way when they are the ones creating doubt about an election, like in Belarus, for example, when, the incumbent won 85% of the vote, but we said, oh, wait, there's probably fraud. And then we said that was not a legitimate election because of the open questions. We did the same thing in Venezuela with Maduro. Again, I'm not pro-Maduro, but the fact is this is part of our color revolution playbook, is to create doubt about who really won the election and then get a mass street mob presence to have the perceptions of legitimacy flow to the will of the people who happens to be astroturfed by the CIA. But what I'm saying is there's a very real possibility that X will get caught up in the heat of what happens in November if the EU says you can't question elections or else you're kicked out of the EU. Well, then, in that case, Elon either has to censor Trump supporters or lose a 550 million person user base, which is the size of the EU. It's a very real possibility that they do something like that. The other thing they're doing is they're using state laws within the country to achieve this, like this California law and like these media literacy laws that are now in over a dozen states that effectively mandate forms of censorship.
I think all of it is diabolical. This is an especially sneaky tactic to use international law because people here in the United States, unless you happen to be a political junkie or unless your area of expertise is following international politics, then you might not hear about that. Or if you do hear about it, it might roll off your back because there are things that impact you in a more tangible way right in front of you. Mike Benz, thank you so much for coming on the show and breaking it down. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Liz. Have a great day.
All right, guys, this next story, imagine for a second, sitting where you are, listening to this or watching this. Imagine for a second that you are a loving Christian family, which you very possibly are, who wants to adopt or foster children. You feel called to do so because of your love for humanity, perhaps because of your faith. Perhaps you have a stable 2-parent home. You live in a nice neighborhood with plenty of children, neighborhood kids around to play with. Maybe you're not super wealthy, but you're rich in what really matters, love and family values. And you're going to strive to be present parents who will help give these children, these neglected, abandoned children, a better life. What could be better for these children who need a family just like yours? Well, in many states, the faith in Jesus Christ that has molded your worldview and shaped your character and motivated you to want to foster and adopt could actually be an impediment to doing just that. How so? Let me explain. In blue states, like Oregon and Tim Walz' Minnesota, the Christian faith, properly lived out, is actually an impediment if you refuse to, quote unquote, affirm radical gender ideology in these children, these foster children or would-be adoptive children. The states, along with the LGBTQIA lobby, believe that your home, if you decline to indulge gender ideology, if you do not promote the idea that a girl can become a boy and vice versa, they believe that your home is worse than no home at all for these kids. This is not hypothetical. There's a family by the name of Harmon in the state of Minnesota who fits the description that I just described. They felt called to adopt 3 sisters who had been in foster care. And yet, the application, when the Harmons submitted for the adoption of these children, their application was initially rejected. Why? Well, the oldest daughter, the oldest of these 3 sisters who were hoping to be adopted by the Harmons, the oldest sister was identified as non-binary. Because this girl identified as non-binary, the state deemed the Harmons, who were practicing Christians, to be, quote-unquote, the wrong fit. Now, this story does have a happy ending, but only thanks to what I would call divine providence. The girl's therapist intervened here and said, you know what? It would be beneficial, most beneficial for these 3 sisters to stay together and to all be adopted into this loving family, the Harmons, who wanted to adopt them. But again, divine providence, thank God, literally, for this therapist. But what would have happened had this therapist not stepped in? Can you count on that in every situation? No, you can't, when the rule is that Christians can't foster because of their belief on sex and gender. Many people around the country don't have this kind of help. So your options are then either to give up your faith, give up, this dream, this call to adoption, or enter into a time-consuming, emotionally exhaustive, financially draining legal battle against the state where victory isn't even guaranteed to begin with. Meanwhile, these children in foster care are suffering. So I have a very special guest with me today, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. She is the founder of the Conscience Project, who's talking about what her organization is doing to empower Christian families to fight back against this outright bigotry from the state aimed at Christian families whose ultimate harm is actually the ultimate harm of the bigotry aimed at Christians is the children in foster care. All right, with me now is the director of the Conscience Project, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer. Andrea, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Liz, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, Andrea, this is an issue that I was not aware of until you brought it to my attention last week. We showed a little bit of the video so that our viewers know what we're talking about here, but the foster care system is not a very good system. And I say that knowing that it's going to cause some controversy, but obviously these children are in horrible situations in their home life. They need someone else to at least temporarily take custody of them. But your reporting has exposed the fact that there's some pretty nasty ideological stuff that's happening in the foster care system that's affecting particularly Christian foster parents. So if you wouldn't mind giving us an overview of how widespread this is, meaning how many kids are in the foster care system, who is this impacting, and how was this brought to your attention?
Yeah, Liz, thank you so much for highlighting this issue. It's dear to my heart just because I learned about it. I'm a mom myself, and I really care about kids and kids that are not being raised or loved the way that they should be in their biological homes. Now, we've got almost about 400,000 kids in foster care in America. And in addition to that, there are kids that are being raised by extended relatives through kinship care, grandparents or aunts and uncles, and this kind of social contagion is affecting those relationships as well. The issue that's happening is almost greater than half, more than half of the states in the country are including gender identity as a protected class governing foster care. And so foster parents, in order to be certified, are being asked to jump through a number of ideological hoops, whether it's using preferred pronouns or bringing kids to gay pride parades or even agreeing to bring them for medical interventions like hormone therapies. And we know that those kinds of therapies are not therapeutic and they're incredibly problematic for young kids. In addition to that, Liz, this current administration, the Biden-Harris administration, just passed some rules that will govern all states that are identifying as designated providers. Those providers for children that identify as LGBTQ, only households that agree to play along. And so it really is kind of a limited view of who these kids are and what their needs are. And frankly, what they need is just a lot of love. And we know that for kids that are searching for a sense of community, oftentimes they're looking to gender identity to answer some of the sense of kind of a lack of belonging, a lack of community. And instead, what they really need is genuine love. What's amazing is the lovely, selfless parents, especially motivated by their faith, who have been serving as foster parents. Nancy Harmon and her husband Jay are some of the most incredible heroes that I've ever met. And there are lots of people out there that are doing simply the heroic in opening their homes to kids in need and just kind of walking with them through what is a really lifelong process of healing from the abuse and neglect that they've suffered.
So the implications of this, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that a Christian or a conservative like myself or like you or like so many of the people that are watching and listening to this right now could be disqualified from being a foster parent. Their home could be rejected as a foster home for these children who need love, who need care, because of their Christian beliefs that a man is a man and a woman is a woman and that children should not be transed.
No, absolutely. And that's the expectation under the federal rules, that they're not even in the mix for kids that identify as LGBTQ. And then other states, especially like Tim Walz's Minnesota, are starting to think that they're not even eligible for kids who may in the future identify as being LGBTQ. That's a case that's currently in the Ninth Circuit out of the state of Oregon with a wonderful mother, a widow with 5 kids, Jessica Bates, who wanted to adopt kids through her state. And the state agency said, no, we're not going to certify you because of your beliefs on the nature of the human person.
It's awful. I mean, I'm almost shocked that I hadn't heard about this because maybe you know the numbers here. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would imagine, given the Christian view on charity, that a lot of foster homes are Christian people with traditional Christian beliefs.
No, Liz, it's incredible. The Christian response, I always like to say, Christians began with fostering with St. Joseph, right? He was taking care of Jesus. And Christians have a very large portion of representation in serving as foster parents in the U.S., I think over 60%. But also they're in it for the long haul. They are twice as likely to adopt than non-Christians and 3 times as likely to become foster parents. And especially when they have a church community around them, the longevity in which they are fostering is much longer than people without that kind of safety net of support offering respite care and encouragement. So this is where the church is shining. And so I guess it's no surprise that we'll see secularists and people promoting progressive ideological agendas to really be trying to exclude Christians from responding to these vulnerable kids.
I mean, listen, I've been saying for quite some time that the ultimate goal of the left is to make sure that Christians can't be doctors, that Christians can't be lawyers, that Christians can't be politicians, that Christians can't be teachers, that Christians now can't be foster parents. They want to, and this is not an exaggeration, they want to relegate Christians to the outskirts of their secular society. They want to make it so that you cannot participate unless you violate your religious beliefs. And it's not only awful in the sense that we each have a right to practice our religion, it's also awful for society and the people who will be deprived care. So I guess I'm interested in how this happened. Is this legislation that was passed in each state? Are these state boards that make these decisions? Are these executive actions, at least at the state level? How did it happen that almost half the states in our country have rules like this governing foster care?
You know, I think it may have started, Liz, with kind of a general idea of, which is a good American idea, of not having discrimination in our social service programs. The problem is what's defined as discrimination has been broadened. And how we look at treating and caring for kids, especially kids who have confusion over their sexual identity, is basically being defined as you're affirming if you perpetuate this confusion. You are discriminatory if you don't. And so in, for example, in the Harmon's, Minnesota, Tim Walz's Minnesota, it's through legislation. Others is also, the social service agencies thinking about the right fit. Oftentimes, the state or the county has psychologists that are kind of guiding kids into this identity and identifying only the families that will buy into it as being the right fit for them. Fortunately, in the case of the Harmons, they had a private psychiatrist, a private therapist who said, under no certain circumstances would it be in these girls' best interest to, one, separate themselves from their other sisters and to leave the Harmon family. That it was the Harmon family that was really going to help them and care for them in the best way possible.
But imagine if they didn't have one psychiatrist that basically came to their rescue. If it weren't for this one person, it's almost a coincidence, right? Yeah. It's or happenstance, like a lottery. It happens to be a good psychiatrist, happens to be a bad one, happens to be one that's thinking about the kid, happens to be one that is more ideologically motivated. You never know. You can't rely on that. What is the recourse here? How do we fix this? Do we have legal mechanisms?
Liz, first I think it was providence, right? I think that some of the recourse that we have is we need to pray more. There are kids in the foster care system where nobody really cares at all about them. It's up to us to start praying for them and caring for their good. And if we can, to participate in foster care, if we have that capacity to do so. As I mentioned earlier in our conversation, there is a great case that's being brought to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by Alliance Defending Freedom. I was a law clerk on that circuit, so I know oftentimes they're not really rooting for religious freedom, but the Supreme Court is. And I think ADF is prepared to bring Jessica Bates's case all the way to the Supreme Court. And as a court watcher, I know that this Supreme Court in particular is attentive to the needs of children, is attentive to the needs of religious freedom, and is really significantly committed to the rule of law and the First Amendment.
So if it does go the way that we want it to go, if this woman, if her rights are upheld, her rights to be a Christian and participate in public society, if the rights of children are upheld, does that erase these, the half of states that say you can't be a Christian and basically if you refuse to indulge gender ideology in children, you can't be a foster parent? Does that override those states?
It'll cover the states that are covered by that circuit. So that's the western part of the country. So California, Oregon, and those are some of the biggest kind of offenders of religious freedom and just the rights of kids. It won't cover those other states that are outside of that circuit. It won't address the Biden-Harris regulations. So I really do think that those regulations at the federal level need to be withdrawn. Hopefully we'll see that, in the coming, the next administration, because it really does put pressure not only on the states that have those rules to continue to kind of ennobles them to continue to enforce them, but it pushes pressure on the other states to do so, because those are regulations that are tied to funding from the Department of Health and Human Services. This is an issue where I really think, the voices of more Americans, families, foster families, people of faith, and just people of sound judgment and common sense need to realize that limiting the number of homes that are available to kids in need at a time where we have a foster care crisis already in our country is one of the stupidest things that could be happening today.
It's more than stupid. I would call it evil.
I agree.
But it is, I hate to have to use these words all the time, but this is what we're facing in our country, this spiritual warfare. It's obviously, this is another front in the foster care system. It seems that state level legislation, maybe even federal legislation too, would be useful in addition to executive action, agency, oversight, and these lawsuits or these court cases that are happening right now. Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, thank you so much, guys. Make sure you visit the Conscience Project to see all the great work that they're doing to protect your right and mine to practice our religion even in the public sphere. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Liz.
All right, guys, if you haven't signed up for the Liz Wheeler newsletter, go do it right now. Go to lizwheelernewsletter.com. Put your email address in so that I can send you a message, send you a note, stay in touch. Show you what kind of show prep we do every day, give you the best headlines, the stuff you need to know when you need to know it. lizwheelernewsletter.com. Thank you guys for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.